So first of all, we're accountants, and so why are we here? We're looking at this from a bit of a different perspective, and so we hope that it adds something to the debate. Click. Yeah, the question we have is how do companies manage? And there's an important word here. How do companies manage financial and non-financial CSR performance? If I was to sort of step back just a little bit, I would say that while we have been talking about triple bottom line, we've been talking about social issues and how they go back to the 1800s and so on. I think it's important to remember that a lot of this movement also had a bit of an origin about 20 years ago with the concern about the environment. We had an Exxon ship that went down, and we began to think about the role of corporations with respect to the environment. Corporations are not the only actors that are responsible for the environment. Human beings have a major role to play. Governments are letting us down phenomenally. But there is a focus on corporations. And so that's where we're looking. And so we've been asking corporations for a little while what their role is and what they've been doing. Now, I think there's two issues. One is that there's a sort of a free rider sense where organizations take assets from the general public or from the environment, and they don't pay for those assets, and they create value, and those values are just then shared by the shareholders. There's another aspect of it in which the corporations destroy assets which have no economic price. You can't put a price on the ozone layer, for example. So we have these sort of concerns about corporations. And we asked them, what about this? What do you do? And what do corporations do? They respond by producing increasingly. The last KPMG report says that almost all of the major corporations now in the world are producing sustainable development reports. And so we look at those reports, and it's very clear that if you were just to take those reports at face value, you'd be pretty impressed. You'd say that organizations must be doing an awful lot to help the environment. Right? But it's a bit like this, you know. There's something going on over here, so the corporation says to us, look over there. Right? The question of denial came up earlier. You suggested it and said that organizations could get caught if they lie. And they don't really lie, do they? They don't say, we don't do any pollution. What they say is, we're really good at this. And when we look at the reports, we see that, you know, from an accounting point of view, this is where we're coming from here. We look at the reports from an accounting point of view, we see an awful lot of inconsistencies or differences between a CSR report and a financial statement. Right? Financial statements have to say the same things about the organization year after year after year. And if we change the way we measure it, or if we change the things we talk about, the auditors put a big note in the bottom and say, pay attention, this is a change. CSR reports, there's absolutely no requirement that we say even the same thing from one year to another. And there's a really nice sleight of hand going on in which 50% of the so-called audited CSR reports are audited by people that don't normally do auditing, which is interesting in itself. But the people who do auditing say, well, it doesn't really matter who does the audit anyway, because we have no standards by which we can do an audit of a CSR report anyway, so anybody can do it. So if you just stop there, you could certainly say this is hypocrisy. This is there's absolutely nothing going on. Now, what we thought we would do, though, is, and I guess it's fair to say we didn't have all of that conclusion when we started this, but what we thought we would do is actually go see the corporations. Now, we're not just going to go and ask them to repeat what's in their development report, but we're using a logic of management control. And so we're looking into the aspects of CSR reporting, and we're looking for the management control mechanisms that are behind that. And we're comparing that to what we would expect to see for economic objectives, for example. So I guess I've covered some of that in the sense that it's a practice that continues to be emerging. It's amazing the celebratory language that KPMG uses in their report and how gleefully they tell us that all these corporations are producing reports now. We want to look behind that and see what we can find out. I guess I covered all of that. We don't really know what they're doing from the literature. Okay, go ahead.
You've already said so many things that are not related to the slides that I'm a bit lost. So anyway, so one of the reasons why we've decided to work on this, there are mainly 5 reasons, and you can see them here. We do believe that CSR issues are really impacting the practices of companies now, which has not always been the case, but when we observe what's happening in practice, I mean, they do change some of their practices. So that's the first reason. Second reason, there is a movement which is not, we will not talk about it now, but that's related to what is called SRI, socially responsible investment, and it is a growing domain in the financial markets. And in this domain, people tend to look at CSR issue through 3 criteria: environment, social issues, and governance issues. And again, when you look at these issues from a company perspective, what is really clear today is that many companies are struggling with these criteria. They don't know how to handle them, how to operationalize these criteria into their management control system. So that's the second reason. Second and third, by the way, SRI and internal issues. The third one is the fourth one, sorry, is more related to our field. One could expect that management control has a role to play in this domain. And again, when you look at what companies do with CSR issues in practice, today it's very, very unclear. So it still has to be explored. So that's the why. I'll let you say maybe a few comments on the literature. You've already talked about reporting, but there may be other elements we haven't addressed. Second one.
Almost all of the CSR literature seems to focus on measures that are prepared by corporations for external audiences. In our field, we would distinguish between measures that are prepared for external use and internal use. So we look at the CSR, or the combination of control and CSR literature, to see what we can find out. We find that there's very few papers that actually look at this question of how do organizations control for CSR goals. We were very interested in seeing how organizations deal with this trade-off, or this potential trade-off of the 3 triple bottom line objectives. How do you deal with issues in which achieving an environmental goal costs you money, for example, or social goals? And we didn't find very much about that. We did find a few cases, and we can go to the next slide.
Maybe just one comment on this one, because that's something which is very much related to what you can find today in financial markets. This question remains very open. Many research have been done, and they have tried to find a link between financial and non-financial performance, and it's very, very unclear still today. Some papers would say that they are correlated, they are clearly correlated. Others would say no, there's no link. And some papers would even say it's the opposite. When you improve your social performance, you may decrease your financial performance. So the conclusion of this today, from a financial markets perspective, is very, very unclear. So that's why we believe it's interesting to look at it from the other side, from the company's perspectives, and to see how companies handle this in practice. Good. So case studies, a few case studies, though.
Are there any case studies? So we found, 14 articles in which, since some of them are multiple, there's 29 cases that we found that say something about the control mechanisms applied to CSR goals is a tough word, but CSR activities. So we find no, go back one. Just note that I didn't put the journals in here, but they're in a whole lot of different journals, which is what perhaps you've noticed in CSR research anyway. It's all over the map. And a lot of different countries as well are represented here. But there's no one case that really just lays it out and says what the organizations are doing, because they didn't have really that objective. But we do find some things which allows us to make a sort of a picture of what we might expect to see. Okay. Now here's the management control theory. We're going to look at a framework. We're going to look at 2 sort of key theories in management control and try to apply these. Simon's levers of control and Kaplan. So Simon's is this. Simon's is a mechanism, or sorry, is a framework that suggests that for any objective, there will be a set of control mechanisms. And these control mechanisms work together, but they won't have the same weight. So these mechanisms, very, very briefly, the first one is belief systems, or core values, or you might say culture. I saw this in an earlier paper today. The idea that the culture of the organization is a mechanism that controls behavior. It's absolutely true, and we know that corporations actually manage that mechanism. The second one would be boundary systems, rules, regulations, policies. So to what extent do we see companies putting in place rules and regulations with respect to CSR goals? The third and the fourth are a bit together. Diagnostic and interactive control systems both talk about measures, but they're different kinds of measures, and they're important. Briefly, they have to do with strategy. And the interactive control systems are measurement systems that are designed to help organizations continuously evolve their strategy, whereas diagnostic systems are ones which are measurement systems that simply help organizations put in place a predetermined strategy. So maybe if you've seen double loop and single loop arguments there. So that's the first thing. We'll look at organizations to see where we find any of that. Secondly, no, we missed one. Kaplan. What happened to Kaplan? What about Kaplan? This is called a balanced scorecard. Balanced scorecards are very, very commonly used now. It's been in our literature for about 20 years to achieve economic goals. So this is the typical balanced scorecard model in which the ultimate goals of the organization at the top are perceived to be financial, and that those financial goals then are seen to be driven, that's a key word, by a series of layers and factors within those layers. And the arrows represent causality. So the strategic idea here is that organizations that are well managed will identify and control and measure not just the finality, not just the final goal, but they will analyze what are the things that need to happen before that. So the very simple logic here is that in order to make money, we need to keep our customers happy. In order for our customers happy, our processes need to work well. And in order for our processes to work well, we have to have some organizational characteristics. Now, so it has been suggested in the literature that CSR should be measured or should be managed in this way. So this is our second test. We look at organizations to see to what extent the companies have specifically tried to identify the drivers of success. And this is important because it says something about the intensity of control. Okay.
You want to go back to this one?
Did we miss that?
Yeah, we missed that, but anyway. So the propositions. So from this review, we derive three propositions. The first one would be an organization will use a diverse range of control mechanism to accomplish its sustainability values. So that's something we'll test through some case studies. Second one, the dominant form of control related to sustainability values is diagnostic measurement systems, and we'll see if it applies or not. And the third one would be it's unlikely that an organization will use a balanced scorecard approach when determining its performance metrics. So that comes from what has been said before by Alexander. Methodology. So we are using a case study approach. So we will in this paper for the moment we only use one case study. We are working on other cases at the moment, so these cases are in progress. So the sources are typically documentation plus interviews of executives. And again, not many papers have been published so far with in-depth analysis of these operational issues. So the case, I see that time is running, so I will go rapidly on the case. The case study in this paper, it's Crédit Agricole Assurance. It's one of the leading European insurance company. It's a company that has always been very well ranked in CSR rankings, which is interesting because, again, one objective could be to compare what is said, what is declared, and what is done inside the company. So this company always appears in the top leagues when you look at CSR rankings. And this subsidiary of this entity of the Crédit Agricole Group, which is a very large entity, has defined an interesting CSR policy with four axes. So one covering the environmental issues, one covering human resources, one covering products and services. So it's really the core of the company, the core business model, and the fourth one covering what they call solidarity, and we'll see what it means. So what we've tried to do with them is to look really at the details of their operations. How do they operationalize their CSR policies, and what kind of targets do they set? How do they monitor these targets? What kind of results they have obtained? So here you see the set of indicators they have defined. So for each axe, there is a set of indicators, and for each indicator, there is a target, and there are some specific actions launched by the company. It started recently. It started in 2010. We are almost at the end of their first CSR plan, and now they are working on the next round. So we are still discussing with them on the evolution of their CSR policy to see how it will change. Maybe to go directly to the conclusion, they are more and more working on the business model itself. Now, some elements that may appear quite peripheral here have been addressed. They have obtained the results they wanted to obtain, and now they are really working on things like product design, product marketing, so things that are really at the core of their activities. So I won't detail all the indicators, but we can come back to this if you want. Some elements of analysis, so it's you.
Well, so taking this model from Simon's, the one with the 4 blue balls, what do we find when we look at their operations? The first thing is that we find that a lot of activity with respect to belief systems. We find effectively that the company believes that the number one tool to change their or to achieve their CSR goals is to change the way people think inside the organization. So we find a film, we find poster campaigns, we find stickers on computers, we find newsletters, we find quarterly newsletters, letters from the CEO, constant communication about environment and social issues to employees. We find a company that says that among all the things they do, this is the this mechanism will achieve 80% of their goals. So unlike the literature, which led me to suppose that we would probably see measures and sort of the cybernetic control mechanisms as the key part, what we see is a lot of focus on values. Secondly, we find boundary systems, all kinds of neat boundary systems, structures. They set up committees, authorities, they set up a CSR department, and so on. Policies, we see purchasing policies. I saw that mentioned today as well. We see very specific policies about suppliers. What kinds of suppliers, what do suppliers have to do, tests that they're going to apply to suppliers. Thirdly, we see physical constraints, specifically things to cut down the use of electricity. As a Canadian, I noticed that one of the things they did was they put a mechanism on the heating system so the heat doesn't come on anymore at the temperature you're used to. It comes on a bit below, and the air conditioning comes on a bit afterwards. Now, if you try that in my office, everybody complained. But they do that after preparing the territory with their communications and so on. So we see these two systems, this one dominant, and then we see the measures. And with respect to measures, you've seen one of the systems, which is the 13 key success factors that they measure internally. But the second system we found was a system very specifically to measure CO2. I don't know if we have a lot of time to talk about it, but what I learned, according to Nicholas, we don't, but I am in charge. But or at least I thought I was. Just briefly, what we find with CO2 is how difficult it is for an organization to measure even that. There's no standard at all anywhere in the world to do that. As accountants, that's shocking to us. There's no way. GRI says you've got to measure it, and if you go to the GRI website, they send you to somebody else's website, and the other website says the same thing. It says measure it, but it doesn't say how. So they spend a lot of time working with an agency, dividing it into 6 pieces, and so it's a whole system in itself. So we find different systems. Now, the question I asked earlier with the Simon's model was, what kind of measures are these? And I said there's 2 different kinds, diagnostic and interactive. These are the common tests that we would use in our literature to make that distinction. I apply that to this case, and I come up with a pretty clear conclusion that these are diagnostic measures. In other words, the main point is that the top management of this organization is not interested in these measures on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis. If something really goes wrong, they want to know, but otherwise, this is not something that they're paying a lot of attention to at all. They're putting out a big CSR report, but they're not paying attention to this. So,
So I've got the control of the mouse, so I skipped the second one. And we talk about the learnings, because I see that time is already running. So a few learnings from this case. And again, it's very much related to what we can observe in other cases. First learning, indicators and scorecards are weak. And that goes back to a debate you find again in the SRI literature, that it's very hard to measure non-financial performances. So you see it in practice, even when you reduce the perimeter, even when you look at only one specific dimension, like wellness of employees, CO2 emission, or these kind of things. It's still very hard to measure. So indicators and scorecards, that's quite logical. They are pretty weak. Second element, beliefs come first. That was very interesting in this case, and in the other cases where we could assume that what is done is successful, that's very interesting to observe that beliefs have a huge impact. I mean, there are really positive elements to move and to improve CSR performances. Third point, does it pay to be good is not an issue. That's a debate that has been extremely present in some literatures. In this case, it wasn't an issue. They wanted to do something. The point wasn't to make it profitable at the beginning. It became profitable, and it's becoming profitable now, but that was not the main entry point for the actions. Fourth point, it ends up affecting the core of the business model. So that's something we observe now as they are designing the next CSR plan. Following point, the need for quick wins to create a virtuous cycle and reinforce internal incentives. That's something that's really related to beliefs. They insisted a lot on this notion of quick wins. So to start with simple, practical things that can really produce results. And a long-term process, and that's where, again, management control systems come into play, because they do internalize the objectives and the routines that have been reinforced by the beliefs. Conclusion, that's the last one. If strategic change is important, management control has to play a role. But the role it plays is quite specific. It doesn't necessarily go through typical indicators, incentives, and this type of mechanisms, simply because measures are not always available, especially in CSR. Managing belief systems represents a key strategic competence, and that's very interesting to see how they articulate the different motivations of top executives, of CSR experts, of communication experts within the company to achieve this. And incentives have to be considered as well. At the beginning, they did not include incentives changes in their approach. Now they are considering this. So that's, again, if you go back to some literature on performance management, you would assume that incentives would be key from scratch. They were not. They are becoming important, but at the beginning, they were not key, and it did not prevent them from achieving very interesting results. So I think we are almost there.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.